Welcome back, everyone, to our discussion of modding in Motorsport Manager. Now, in our previous video, we talked about championships, and one of the things we looked at were the various teams that were contained within the championship and how to determine those. Well, in this video, we're going to take a look a little bit more in depth at the actual file that has all of the teams in it. Now, by default, like most of the rest of the text files, particularly those with a lot of information in it, it is a huge undertaking to try to understand everything. Everything is separated by commas. All the sections are separated by commas as the delimiter, but it's still very hard to read. So instead, we're going to refer to the spreadsheet version to make things a little easier to follow. Okay, so here's what the teams file looks like in spreadsheet form. And so we have the names of all of the teams. Now, this is still default. You saw last time in the team file that I had changed ZRT Motorsport to Knee Pit Gaming. But here, these are all the default information. So here are your teams, your IDs, you got your colors for both the car and logos, I would assume is what that's worth. Then you have your team worth, which I don't believe is working properly in the game because every time I've used ZRT, it never changes. It never goes up. Even once I'm tier 1, 5-star sponsors, winning championships, it never changes. So I think that isn't quite working the way it is supposed to. Then you get into financial health. You can see that most of the tier 1 teams are in at least average health. Most of the tier 2 teams are in average health, and then a lot of the tier 1 teams are in weak financial health. Then you have your political attributes. And what this relates to is each rule change that is introduced will appeal to some teams and other teams will be against it. So you have your traditionalist teams, which prefer traditionalist type rules. And then you have other teams that prefer more gimmicky or more progressive rules and so forth. So that's the way that works. So as the different rules come up, this is how it is determined who votes for what, which teams vote for which rules. And then it gives you a brief biography of the various teams and how they fit into the history of the game. Also, it will denote arrival, and again, that's an ID based off of their order in the list. The amount of pressure that would be, I assume this means the amount of pressure that would be on you should you start out with this team. You can see it's generally lower when you get down into some of the tier 1 teams, although a few of the tier 1 teams have very high pressure, comparatively speaking. Then you have the reputation of the team at the very beginning, the beginning budget for the team, and this would be in millions. So for ZRT, you see that it is $500,000 or $500,000, and then you can see the budgets for all the different teams, including a couple in the negative. So you've got a driver's budget, a car budget, race payment. I assume that this is the amount of money they are making per race, rather than them having to sign sponsors as AI cars. I would assume that they're getting that. It's either that or likely some percentage of the sponsorship money that is maximally available. So again, I'm assuming this is relating to how the AI run the team more than anything. Marketability Fanbase, this is something that we talked about before. In the base game, it by default doesn't seem to be working properly because for ZRT here next to the bottom, I've never seen that change from 0.2. It may even go down to 0.1, in fact, but I've never seen it increase even as I have 5-star sponsors and move up through the tiers and finally winning a tier 1 championship. I've never seen that number increase. Then you've got a stock price. Now I find that interesting because I'm not sure how that's implemented or if it's implemented at all. So again, an example of some things that might be in there for the future, who knows? Then you got some other information that, again, I think most of this defaults to how the teams start off. For example, you've got priorities for the various teams. Some teams are all about the money. Some teams are immediately wanting to fire a driver, and so on. Then you have your expectation levels, which again, I have not gotten into all of this. I think the expectation levels, my best guess right now is that this relates to whenever you first join a team, they're going to tell you, here's what we think of our number one driver. And this relates to the comment number in a comments file somewhere, I'm sure. Here's what we think of this particular driver. And you can see number one comment is used multiple times. And then various other opinions of the manager and so on. Okay, all of these, I believe, relate to a comments file somewhere that lays those out, just like it does with most things in the game. Everything corresponds to a number in a file. Then you got your merchandise sales. Again, I'm not exactly sure how that relates to the game or even if that changes as the game moves on. And then you have aggression. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the aggression means because I've not played around with that much. But I do know there is another file that relates to how the pit stop strategy and the overall race strategy that the AI use. And I believe that is somehow related. In other words, you see team number 2 here, or the actual first team in the list, which would be Steinman, is very aggressive. So that means that they're probably going to make more aggressive pit calls, more aggressive race strategy, as opposed to 0.1, which I actually believe is Ferrari, or no, that's actually Windsor, not Scuderia Rossini. So it gives a little bit of the intent, I believe, is to give a little bit of flavor to instead of every AI car driving exactly the same and approaching the race exactly the same, this gives a little bit of variation within it. Okay, so that takes care of the team file, which again, I had alluded to in the previous video when we were talking about the championships, but I wanted to come back to it in a little bit more detail in this video to hint at some things that I didn't in the previous one. The second thing that I wanted to talk about in this particular video are the parts. And these are not the components themselves that you see whenever you're developing parts, such as, plus 20 to max speed or plus 60 to reliability, that type of thing. Those are all contained here within the part components, which I'm not really going to get into too much because I feel like that's fairly self-explanatory for the most part. You get a description of what the part is, it's got a graphic associated with it, which parts does it relate to, and so on. So I'm not really going to get into that a whole lot. But what I do want to touch on are the parts themselves and how they're laid out. Now, we've learned from previous videos and looking at the championships, championship 0 is tier 1. The number 1 will correspond to tier 2. And then finally, the 2 will correspond to tier 3. And then you've got your various types of parts. And you'll notice that each championship has all of the parts listed. Okay, and the reason for that is what they're doing here is they are establishing a few things. First, min and max stats. Okay, and what this would be is when you start the game, what is the minimum engine for it? So we're dealing with tier 1 teams here. What is the minimum engine that they could possibly have? And it would be a performance number of 600. What's the maximum they could have? 1350. So you can see that would be sort of your maximum spread at the beginning for a max stat. And again, once you get above these numbers, you get over here in the championship minimum and championship maximum, you start talking about how the minimum would be the same as what you see over here. But the maximum is, I believe, above this number is when the game wants to reset the performance of all the teams back to, to a lower level. So you're sort of starting from fresh there, and then you start all over using these numbers again. So again, that might not be exactly how it works, but that's, I think, the general idea of what they're doing. Then you can see, so in the tier 1 series, you can get up to almost 3,000 before it wants to reset. You come down into tier 2, not quite 1,600, and then finally around 900 for tier 1 teams before it wants to reset. Okay, then you talk about, okay, for the engines, how much does it cost for a tier 1 team to develop an engine? Now, all of these are the same for all 3 tiers, but you can see there's a possibility that you could change these out and make it much less expensive for a tier 3 team for instance, to develop an engine than a tier 1 team to develop an engine. So the possibility exists. Then you get into the base time that it takes to develop this part. 14 days is the base amount of time to develop an engine, 12 for a gearbox, and so on. And again, you can make this change based on the tier and the series. Then we come into the different slots and how much time they add to development. So for an engine, you start with 14 days. And then for the, and I forget the exact name of the different parts, but I think it's average, good, great, and so on like that. So average parts don't add any additional development days. Then good parts add 2 each, and so on. So if you've played the game for any amount of time, you're familiar with how that works. So again, you can change these and make them dependent on the tiers, although the game by default does not. It takes the same amount of time to develop an engine in tier 1 as it does tier 3, and the same on goes for all the other parts as well. Then we get over into what does each slot cost? Well, we know we've got our base cost for the engine is 1.5 million. Okay, we've already determined our times. Now we need to determine how much each additional slot costs. And of course, your very first iteration of development each year will have 1 slot open, and then you'll move to 2, 3, 4, and then finally, if you have all of the necessary HQ buildings, then you can open up all of the slots. And this lets you know how much each additional slot costs. So it costs 50,000 for the average, for the first slot. Then you go up to 100,000 and so on. Then finally, you get into the unlocks. Okay, and what the unlocks do is, how can I get to the different levels of the engine? Well, and it says to unlock the level 3, which on the design screen, if you remember, the first 2 levels are automatically unlocked for you, and you can develop those even without any HQ buildings at all. So if you want to get to level 3 for an engine, then you need to have built test track at least to level 1. If you want to unlock level 4, you need test track 2, and then finally, for the max level, you need to have a maximum upgraded level 3 test track, and so on. So you can change these as you see fit. And in fact, for my purposes, I have changed these a great deal because the simulator no longer is responsible for developing rear wings. Rear wings and front wings are now developed by the wind tunnel. So I've changed these around a good deal. And again, it's very simple to do. So as I've done in previous videos, let's say you've made a bunch of changes. Now, how do I get these into the game? Well, so you've made your changes. In this case, we'll say you've made changes to the parts file. Okay, so you've gone in, made the changes to, not the spreadsheet, if you decide to do a spreadsheet version of this, because it is a comment delimited file, it's pretty easy to do. But let's say that you've gone in, you've edited your text file, and now you're ready to add it to the game. So what you'll do is come into your asset bundle extractor, open it up, file, open, and then find your resource.assets file. Open that up. And again, we'll give it a second here to open up. Expand this just a little bit so we can see it a little easier. These are all the files that are within, and every change I've made so far to the game has been within this file, the resources.assets file. Okay, and you can find the file that you're interested in, doing a search by name, or you can simply organize it by name, type, etc., and get to what you want. So we want the parts. Okay, so we're going to scroll down through until we get to the P's, and it will start going very quickly as I get toward the bottom. And let's see if I can actually do this without going too far by. There we go. So now we find, make sure you get the exact file, because you can see some of these have very similar names. So if you're replacing a file or altering a file, make sure you get the correct file. So we got our parts, then we're going to come over to plugins. And then at the beginning, when we were extracting all our information, we use the export. Now we're going to use the import, because we want to overwrite the information that's already in there with information from outside the file. So import from text. And then we're going to go to the location of the file that we want to import. So in our case, we're going to go to modded files, and the parts file is the one we've been making our changes to. You're going to press open, and then as soon as you do that, an asterisk is going to appear next to the name of the file in the appropriate column. That is letting you know that it's uploaded the information and made the appropriate changes. Once you've made the changes to all the files that you need to, then you're simply going to go to File, Save. And then once you save the file, then you would come back out, find your file, and copy it over into under your Steam location. Go to Steam Apps, Common, Motorsport Manager, and then in the mm_data file, you will find the resource.assets file, and that's the one that you would overwrite with your new file. Again, these changes only take effect, to the best of my knowledge, whenever you create a new career, a new save file. If you want to make any changes, which I don't recommend, to existing save files, you would need another way to alter that, most likely using binary, but in a hex editor. But we're not going to get into any of that, because that's a whole different discussion, and one I don't recommend for most people. And again, this, as well as the previous videos I've done, are a way of making mods and making, whether they're small or very ambitious, larger mods, but they're all predicated on the fact that we don't have access to the Steam Workshop right now, because we're not sure whenever they update the game to add that functionality in. We're not sure if they're going to make some adjustments to make files a little easier for us to get to, and what format changes they may make. Who knows? All of this may get quite a bit easier to do in the future. We'll just have to wait and see how much of the game they open up to us. So thank you very much for joining me once again, and stay tuned for more Motorsport Manager.